Hi, my name is Dr. Nadine Thornhill. I am an educator specializing in child and adolescent sexuality. For over 10 years, I have been helping families have open, honest conversations with their children and teens about bodies, relationships, and more. I'm here today in partnership with the University of Toronto Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Centre and the Family Care Office to talk to you about how you can start or continue conversations about consent with the tweens in your family. If you are just starting to have these conversations, some of the information in our previous webinar, Consent for Children, may be helpful for you as well. This video was recorded on land which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe-Waukee, and the Haudenosaunee. Today this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My role is to give you a little advice and information about how to approach the conversation about consent with your teens. But this is your webinar, and as you're watching and listening, if you find that there are things that don't work for your family, that's fine too. I do hope that you will find a lot of this information helpful, but of course it is up to you to decide what will and will not work for your family and your situation. And because this is your webinar, you are free to go through the information at your own pace. You can certainly sit and watch it all in one sitting, or you can break it up over time. You are also welcome to go back and review anything anytime you would like. As I mentioned in Consent for Children, people develop and mature at different rates. That's why I don't personally love the term age appropriate when it comes to sex education, because age alone doesn't tell us much about what a person is capable of understanding or what their experiences have been. Generally speaking, the information in this webinar is intended for youth in late childhood or early adolescence. However, I trust you to make the call in terms of what you feel is appropriate information for your specific tween. There are 5 segments in this webinar: conversation tips, what consent means and how it works, boundaries, media and consent, modeling consent. As in our previous webinar, we are going to cover several topics, and there will be a couple brief mentions of sexual assault or sexual abuse. I understand that these topics can be very sensitive and may be triggering or activating for some folks, especially survivors, so I would like to let you know that these mentions of sexual assault and sexual abuse will take place at this time and also at this time. Please practice whatever care you feel is best for you. And one last note before we dive in, remember that none of the information in this webinar is meant to replace professional legal or medical advice. Now, sit back, make yourselves comfortable, and let's talk about teaching consent to tweens. Here are a few conversation tips you can use during your discussions about consent with your tweens. Ask a lot of open-ended questions. An open-ended question is any question that requires more than a yes or no answer. So, do you know what consent means? Is a closed-ended question, but what do you think consent means is an open-ended question. Try to listen to your children without expressing negative judgment. As human beings, making judgments and assumptions is part of how our brains try to make sense of all the information we constantly have coming in. However, if you can try to avoid expressing negative judgments or opinions, at least initially when you're having these conversations with your child, it can make it easier and more comfortable for them to speak with you honestly. Believe what your tweens tell you. Sometimes as adults, we have a tendency to assume that our tweens are too young to have certain feelings or to understand certain experiences. But if you are having a conversation and your tween says something like, "I don't think I'm ever going to have a crush on anyone," we can believe that they're being sincere in that moment and respond with something like, "Well, that's okay," as opposed to saying, "Well, you'll change your mind when you're older." By doing that, we're letting our tweens know that we trust them, that we believe them, and that we are safe people they can confide in. You can talk about some of your own experiences. Like anyone else, it can be reassuring for tweens to know that we've been through some of the same things that they have. Sometimes you will not have the answers, and sometimes you will make mistakes, and that is okay. As parents and caring adults, we sometimes feel pressure to do everything in the best way possible for our kids, particularly when it comes to talking about sensitive and important subjects like consent. But the reality is that sometimes they will have questions and we won't know the answer. Or sometimes we'll be having a conversation and we'll say things in ways that we may not love. And that's okay. If you don't know the answer, it is okay to say to your kid, you know what, I don't know right now. Let me find out and get back to you in a day or two. If you've had a conversation and you weren't happy with the way it went, it is okay to go back to your kid and say, you know what, I'm not happy with the way that went, and I would love to talk about this with you some more. Have many short conversations over a long period of time. Like a lot of people, most tweens learn more effectively when they get small bits of information over a long period of time, as opposed to getting a lot of information all at once. So instead of sitting them down for one big consent talk, consider making consent part of the everyday conversations you have with them throughout their tween and teen years. Things to remember from this segment: ask open-ended questions. Avoid expressing negative judgments. Believe what children tell you. Share some of your own feelings and experiences. It's okay to make mistakes. Have many short conversations over a long period of time. If you are looking for a way to start the conversation with your tween about consent, one way is by asking them the very simple question, what do you think consent means? If they are unsure or they would like an explanation, you can let them know that consent is agreeing to share an experience with someone. It's also agreeing on how, when, and what that experience will involve. Consent is important when sharing experiences with friends and family, with our peers, in interactions that are sexual and romantic, and in interactions with folks online. Consent is also important in the interactions that we have with strangers or people we don't know very well, and even in our interactions with people that we don't particularly like. You might also ask your tween what sort of situations require consent. Some examples may include when we want to touch people, when we want to play a game or do something with a friend, when we want to use or borrow something that does not belong to us, when we want to be in someone's space, like their room, their home, their yard, etc. When we want to share a picture of someone online, or we want to share information about someone online. You can explain to your tweens that because of their age, there are still aspects of their lives where you are making decisions on their behalf and they may not yet be able to fully consent. And these can include medical decisions, where they live, attending school, financial decisions, household management. In the Consent for Children webinar, I talked in detail about when an adult makes a choice on behalf of a child in order to help them versus when an adult might make a choice on behalf of a child that harms them. If you would like more information, then again, you can go back and check out the Consent for Children webinar. For many teens, as they grow older, they will gradually be able to take over responsibility for these various decisions and consent on their own behalf. There are some youth with developmental disabilities who may never be able to take over their own care completely. We do know that people with disabilities do experience sexual assault and sexual abuse at higher rates than the general population. So it is important to note that someone needing care does not negate their right to consent to sexual or affectionate touching. There are also specific laws about sexual consent and age. To learn more about these laws in Canada, you can visit Age of Consent to Sexual Activity at Justice Canada. I will put the website right here. It will also be in the resource section that is included at the end of this webinar. Things to remember from this segment. Consent is an agreement about when, how, and which experiences we are going to share with others. Tweens can practice consent in a variety of interactions with friends, family, classmates, and acquaintances. Adults will consent on behalf of tweens in certain situations. Let's talk about what boundaries are. Boundaries are something that mark limits. A fence around someone's yard marks the limits of that property. Borders are invisible boundaries that mark the limits between provinces, countries, and continents. When we talk about boundaries and consent, we're talking about the limits we each place on what we will and won't do. Having personal boundaries helps us feel safer, healthier, and more joyful. Our emotions, our thoughts, our physical bodies, our beliefs, our values, our identities, our traditions, our communities, and even our financial situation come into play when we are making decisions about what our boundaries are. And just like a fence or a border, our boundaries can change. But when we're talking about personal boundaries, those changes can happen over time, day to day, or even minute to minute. One way that personal boundaries are often different from physical or geographical boundaries is that our personal boundaries can be very different depending on the situation. For example, I have personal boundaries around kissing that are very different for my family, my friends, strangers, and my partner. And even with my partner, my personal boundaries when I am in a good mood are very different than my personal boundaries when I'm in a bad mood. Consent is about figuring out how to share experiences that fit within everyone's boundaries. It's also about the right to refuse any experience that pushes us outside of our boundaries, whatever those may be. Boundaries show up in all kinds of ways. For tweens, it could be wanting to hang out with a friend one day, but not the next day. Feeling uncomfortable being hugged or kissed or tickled by a parent when they're in public. Not sharing the same feelings as someone who has a crush on them. Wanting to keep certain information off of social media. Only sharing their sexual orientation with certain people in their lives. Not wanting to take part in an activity they feel is dangerous or harmful to themselves or to somebody else. Not disclosing the gender they were assigned at birth. When it comes to friendships, crushes, online interactions, and other types of socialization, tweens have a right to operate within their own boundaries. Now, the truth is that sometimes saying no or defending boundaries can be hard, and not just for tweens, for anyone. As the adults in their lives, you can talk to them about this. Generally speaking, there are 3 ways to say no or defend a boundary, and you can take some time to talk to your tween about each of them. There is the passive refusal. Some signs of a passive refusal include using a quiet tone of voice, closed off or distant body language, such as folding arms or moving away from somebody, avoiding eye contact, using uncertain language like maybe, I guess, agreeing verbally with words but using a disagreeable tone of voice or body language. It's fine. Or leaving the choice to another person. Whatever you want to do is fine. Youth may use a passive defense when they're worried about angering or upsetting another person. They're afraid the other person might retaliate. They've been taught to prioritize being nice, agreeable, or pleasant. They are dealing with someone who holds authority or has power over them. Saying no or defending their boundaries is a new or unusual experience. Then we have the aggressive refusal. An aggressive refusal can include a loud and angry tone of voice, threatening or menacing language. If you come near me, I swear I will. Intimidation, which can be moving into somebody's physical space, glaring, raising hands or fists. Or physical emotional violence, such as hitting, kicking, punching, biting, pushing, or slapping. Youth may use an aggressive defense or refusal when someone has been violent or aggressive with them. They have experienced harmful consent violations in the past. They are mimicking behavior that they have learned from others. They feel they are in immediate danger of serious harm. They have been taught that aggression is expected or acceptable behavior. And then we have the assertive refusal. An assertive refusal usually involves a confident and firm tone of voice, direct language like, no thank you, I don't want to do that. Grounded body language, sitting up, standing up, looking someone in the eye and relaxed posture, and a calm, confident demeanor. Youth may use an assertive no or an assertive defense when they believe that their choice will be respected. They are confident in their ability to deal with any negative consequences. They believe they are making the right decision. Saying no is a familiar experience. They know they will be able to rely on support from family, friends, or their community. It may sound like the assertive refusal is the happy medium between the passive refusal and the aggressive refusal, but there are situations where each of these types of refusal may be appropriate. You can ask your tween if they can think of examples where it might be appropriate to use each type of refusal. For example, if we think that someone might lash out and try to harm us either physically or emotionally, then using a passive refusal to try and keep that person calm may be a good strategy. If someone is trying to force us to do or go somewhere that is unsafe and is putting us in danger, then aggression, including hitting, biting, kicking, scratching, or anything else we might do to get away from that person, is appropriate. When we are with people that we trust, these could be our friends, our families, neighbors, crushes, people that we know we can count on to treat us well, then an assertive refusal is often appropriate. It's also important for tweens to learn how to accept refusals from others, and it is especially important for them to understand that passive refusals and even nonverbal forms of refusal are still valid and need to be honored and respected. You can remind tweens that some people are timid, some people are less assertive, or they may not know how or may not even be physically able to verbalize a no. And when we encounter these people, it is not okay to use their passivity as an excuse to try and pressure or push them into doing things that they don't want to do. We can also let tweens know that it can and does take time and practice to learn how to say no and how to defend our boundaries, and that even when it feels uncomfortable for us, it is still okay to do it. It's also okay if your tweens don't always know what their boundaries are. Life is full of new experiences, and we can't always predict how we're going to feel or how we're going to react when we encounter a new situation. Again, that's why personal boundaries and consent can be different for different people in different situations. Giving tweens lots of opportunities to explore what their boundaries are in terms of fun, affection, and personal connection will allow them to develop a stronger sense of what they do and don't want in their relationships. Conversations around boundaries also need to be tailored to your tween, their identity, and their specific experience. Asserting boundaries may look different for different people and can depend on things like their gender, their race and ethnicity, their citizenship, whether they are disabled or able-bodied, their access to wealth, their religion or faith. For example, when a Black youth is told that they need to wear their hair in a style that is contained in order to be neat at school, or an immigrant youth is encouraged to abandon their cultural sayings and speak proper English, those youth are being told by society that they need to change their bodies or the way that they behave in order to serve the comfort of the majority. We live in a society that tells people with certain identities that they are not as entitled to everyone else to their own boundaries, and that they may have to change their behavior or their bodies in order to make other people comfortable. For these youth, it may be worth having some extra conversations to let them know that while that is the message that they may be getting from society, they are in fact as entitled to everyone else to have their own boundaries and to assert those boundaries. These tweens may also need extra encouragement learning how to assert their boundaries and how to make their own safety, health, and joy a priority. Before we wrap up our discussion about boundaries, I would like to quickly address sexual violence. Sexual violence is when one person forces another person into sexual contact or a sexual situation that violates that person's boundaries. If your tween tells you that they have experienced some form of sexual abuse or sexual violence, you can refer back to the Consent for Children webinar, where I discuss in details ways that you can support your tween. Things to remember from this segment. Boundaries are limits we place on what we will and won't do. Personal boundaries can and do change. There are different styles of refusal. Tweens may still be exploring their boundaries. Identity can affect tweens' perception of their boundaries. Sexual violence is a violation of a person's sexual boundaries. Right now, a lot of tweens live at least some portion of their lives in digital spaces. We can encourage them to say no and defend their boundaries when online or text interactions do not feel okay for them. We can also encourage them to accept and respect other people's boundaries when it comes to things like sharing texts, sharing pictures, or posting information online. Mainstream media can influence our ideas about what we perceive as normal in sexual and romantic relationships, particularly when it comes to consent and how it's supposed to work. By the tween years, a lot of youth are listening to music and watching TV or movies that deal with crushes, dating, and sex. For example, over time, a lot of television shows, movies, even songs and books have reinforced a problematic gender dynamic. It's one where a man continues pursuing a woman after she has indicated that she is not interested. The woman is often shown to feel desired and flattered by the man's constant attention. In media, these are often relationships where a boy or man is pursuing a girl or a woman, but in real life, this behavior is unacceptable regardless of the gender dynamics involved. If a scene or alert like this comes up, you can ask your tween, how would you feel if someone that you weren't interested in romantically kept pursuing you like this? What would you want someone to do if you told them that you didn't have a crush on them or that you didn't want to be with them in a romantic or sexual way? Why do you think situations like these are sometimes portrayed as romantic? You can talk to your tween about the importance of respecting other people's choices when it comes to crushes, dating, hookups, and romance. In real life, continuing to pursue someone after they have let us know that they are not interested is a form of pressure, and it can be really, really harmful. You can also be honest with your tween about the fact that being rejected is often painful, and it can take a while for that pain to go away. But eventually it will, and the alternative, which is trying to badger, pressure, or force someone to be with us when they really don't, is not a way to avoid feeling that pain. You can also make a point of sharing media with your tweens that have positive portrayals of consent. Websites like Common Sense Media, I'll link it here, it will also be in the resource section at the end, can help you find content with great portrayals of consent. Consent can also enhance our online and digital interactions. Remind your tweens that they should get consent if they want to, share or post images of people other than themselves, share or post information about people other than themselves. You can remind youth that just like in real life, we should not pressure or force people into interactions online that they are not comfortable with. This includes texting, sharing images, direct messages, also known as DMing, and other online interactions. Things to remember from this segment. Media can influence tweens' ideas about consent. Media can provide opportunities to talk about how consent is portrayed. Consent is critical in healthy online relationships. One of the most powerful ways to teach youth about consent is to model the behavior you hope to see from them. Does this mean that you have to ask your tween every time you want to hug or kiss or touch them? You probably don't have to be that rigid about it unless that is what your kid wants. What you can do is pay attention to their verbal and nonverbal cues. So if you go in for a hug and they respond with, "Ah, mom," or make a face or pull away, don't force it. Another option if you want to get cuddly is by indicating to your tween that you are open to physical affection by doing something like holding your arms out. That way, it is up to them whether or not they want to participate in that hug or whether they just want to let it go for now. If you have a sexual or romantic partner, a spouse, or someone else, and you choose to flirt, share affection, and communicate about your relationship in front of your tween, it can give them a really great real-life example of what consent looks like in a healthy relationship. Speaking up and standing up for yourself teaches youth the important lesson that we as adults also have a right to our own boundaries. Finally, modeling consent in our own digital lives is important as well. Specifically, checking in with our kids and tweens before we post their photos or information about them on our own social media feeds shows them that they have a right to control their own information and that they should do the same with others as well. Also consider removing photos or information if your tween consents but later decides that they do not want that information on your feed. Again, it shows them that consent is ongoing, that boundaries can change, and that we should respect others when they let us know that those boundaries have changed. Things to remember from this segment. Modeling is an effective way to teach tweens about consent. Practice consent in your own relationships. Get consent before posting about your tween online. Helping tweens understand consent can provide a strong foundation for their relationships with friends and family now, and serve them well as they begin to explore sexual and romantic relationships in the years to come. If you would like to know more about consent, please visit consent.utoronto.ca. To learn more about the Sexual Violence Prevention and Support Centre and the Family Care Office, visit www.svpscentre.utoronto.ca and familycare.utoronto.ca. If you would like to learn more about my work or get in touch with me, you can contact me through my website, NadineThornhill.com. On Twitter and Instagram @NadineThornhill. You can check out my YouTube channel, Nadine Thornhill, or you can email me, info@NadineThornhill.com. And please stay tuned for a list of additional resources. Thank you for spending time with me. Bye. Be sure to check out our other webinars. The links can be found in the description below.